Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Bart Sibrel here with a special public episode of Box Escape. We have with us a special guest, Rasa, who is a specialist at the Chinese Space Agency, who has some knowledge of the moon landing fraud, apparently common knowledge among his coworkers. So why don't you first tell us about what you do, and as the story goes along with what China knows about the moon landings.
I was working in this department we call quantum energy, what most people refer to as a free energy technology. That was my main job. I was working with them, and I met the space agency people back in 2016. But I didn't want to work for them until much later. It wasn't maybe 2022 that I said, okay, what would you guys like for me to do for you? And then they asked me to research what is NASA doing to protect the astronauts from the space radiation on the Artemis missions. So that was the job they gave me. So research the NASA articles in English and just translate that to Chinese. So that's my job here.
Why don't they just use what worked in 1969? It doesn't seem like they would need a new technology, would they? It worked so great. All the guys survived into their 80s and 90s without cancer.
Right. So we all know that, there's no way human beings could have survived the radiation back then. There's three kinds of radiations. You have the normal gamma rays and X-rays, and then you have also the solar particle events, and then you also have the galactic cosmic radiation. There's no protection from that. Whatever kind of shielding you try to put there, it just passes through that and creates a secondary scatter on the inside, which goes right through your DNA. So yeah, there's no way a human being could have survived it back then. And if they do try to send human beings on this Artemis II, I doubt they're going to be coming back in one piece,
So what these Chinese space agency employees told you about their knowledge of the moon landing fraud and the arrangement that they have with NASA to keep it a secret.
Okay, it's kind of a complex story. There are many space agencies around the world who know that the Apollo missions didn't happen. The reason they're keeping secret about it is for different reasons. Like, for example, Elon Musk is keeping secret about it because he's got the NASA contract, right? So the way the thing goes is just keep quiet, and then we'll admit it ourselves publicly that we faked the Apollo missions. So this is why people like Elon Musk are lying for NASA. And other countries are also lying for NASA. India is lying for NASA. Japan is lying for NASA. Russia is lying for NASA. Now, China has a different agreement, however. China said, we will not expose it as a hoax, but we will not lie for you. So China has never said the moon landings were real.
From what you told me, they have an agreement to not expose the fact that it was a fraudulent series of missions in exchange for receiving under the table space technology. Can you verify that?
Well, yeah, okay. So the people at NASA are, of course, controlled by the United States government, but the people at NASA are mostly scientists, so they're not so much into politics. And back, 10, 12 years ago, the U.S. Congress banned China from the International Space Station. And some of the employees at NASA were not too happy about that. After the U.S. Congress banned NASA from releasing technology to China, then what NASA did is they're just leaking the technology through the European Space Agency. So what that means is that the Chinese space station is actually just a copy of the ISS. And if they wanted to, these two ships could link together because it's the same technology. And the European Space Agency has been training the Chinese astronauts how to go up to the Chinese space station. So that's been going on for quite a long time.
according to congressional law, it's illegal for China to receive space technology about the space station, but they're doing it anyway. And they're just
Right.
having it go through the European Space Agency. Now, what you told me before was that this is active, intentional blackmail from China against the United States to get that technology in exchange for not blowing the whistle on the fact that the Apollo missions were fraudulent. Is that the case?
I wouldn't use the word blackmail there. It's just an agreement they have where, okay, we'll keep quiet until you guys admit it for yourselves. And this is what all the other space agencies are doing.
Right,
Even
but
NASA employees.
but you have to add, and they will keep quiet if the U.S., against congressional law, meaning illegally, send them space technology that they're not supposed to receive legally or otherwise. They will continue to remain quiet if they receive that technology, which is illegal for the government to give them. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can put it that way. It is, according to the U.S. law, presently, it is illegal, but that's just a U.S. law. It's not an international law.
Right, but it's the U.S. citizens who are working for the government who are violating the own law that they wrote through Congress. And they're doing that because China knows that the moon missions are fake, and they have agreed not to say so publicly as long as they receive this illegal technology on how to build a space station better. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can put it that way.
China is blackmailing
Yeah,
the United States, and the federal government is violating their own Espionage Act in the process. What a surprise. The government is full of hypocrites.
in the scientific community, whether it's the European Space Agency or the India or Japan, these scientists have this kind of a unwritten agreement. It's a friendly thing. The intention of China is not to blackmail. I mean, it's just a friendly agreement. Like, okay, we'll keep quiet for you because we promised we would.
In exchange for receiving technology that is illegal for the United States
Right?
to give them.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
definitely.
What other experiences would you like to share specifically about China's knowledge? You told me basically that everybody in the Chinese Space Agency knows that the Apollo missions were fake. Is that pretty much the case?
The people who work for the Chinese Space Agency, we don't publicly announce that it was a hoax. There are Chinese web pages which talk about it being a hoax, but these web pages are not made by Chinese Space Agency employees because it would be ungentlemanly of us if we did that publicly, exposing it as a hoax.
Any other comments that you'd like to share?
Actually, I have some questions for you if you don't mind.
Oh, no, I'm on the spot. Okay, go ahead.
My first question is I'd actually like to hear more about your story about, when the CIA had imprisoned you and that whole story. I mean, most of my followers from my Facebook page, they've read your book. I want to hear more about that story. It seems like there needs to be some more details that we all want to hear about.
Yes, well, when you have 2 weeks, I will be glad to tell you that story. You haven't read the chapter, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to CNN and A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Church? Because I go into pretty good detail in those chapters in the book,
Yeah,
Sibrel.com.
right. It's just I have some kind of specific questions. Like at one point you said that there was kind of a two factions within the government, and one of them chose to bail you out, essentially, and save you from that other faction which had imprisoned you.
Yeah, that's correct. So I have to interpret what that means. Basically, when I was being illegally kidnapped, two people, as best as I could tell, who worked for what was called the MCIA, the Marine Corps Intelligence Activity Department. They literally kidnapped me from the kidnappers, you could say, and gave me a debriefing. We're very concerned for my health because the other party had drugged me illegally. They took my blood pressure. I think they might have been medical personnel as well as intelligence personnel. I got the impression they were like good spies, bad spies within the federal government, which there probably are. They're corrupt on both sides. So it appears to me that even though most people are honest and good, if you can control the president, then that corrupt president appoints the corrupt leaders of the FBI, the CDC, the FDA, and so forth. And people who were honest in the FBI said, look, we had proof of a senator taking bribes, but we were told if we pursued it, we'd be fired. So they backed down. So it's actually pretty easy to control the government, even though there are mostly honest workers in it, because the people at the top controlling the control valves are the corrupt ones. And that's the case to this day. So when things like the moon landing fraud happened, Kennedy assassination, 9/11, or whatever, where intelligent people, honest people in the government saw what was really going on, apparently they created a separate faction. And so when I was being detained for trying to get proof of the moon landing fraud to CNN, a tape we discovered of them faking part of the moon mission right in front of your eyes, apparently this other group came in to make sure I was okay. And all this is talked about in great detail in my book at Sibrel.com. And it's really the first time I ever publicly talked about it. I already figured, hey, I'm trying to get people to accept a very bizarre truth. They really did fake the moon landing. I don't want to make that any more difficult than going into the CIA, abducted me and gave me truth serum to find out where the originals of this tape were. But that did happen. So Moon Man
Yeah.
goes into great detail about that, including, as you know, the deathbed confession of an eyewitness who saw them film the first fake moon landing at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968 and said so as he was dying, that he even murdered a coworker to cover it up. So the saddest thing about the moon landing fraud is that it's true. I mean, who would have thought they really did fake the moon landing? You cannot have 1,000 times greater space traveling technology in 1969, when all of NASA has 1 millionth the computing power of a cell phone, than you can today with 5 decades better rockets and computers, where they can send astronauts only 1,000th the distance to the moon, despite having 5 decades of better technology. You cannot have better
Mm.
technology in the past and in the future,
Right.
which means it was a bluff, like in poker. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And Eugene Krantz said a person in the command center can tell no difference between a practice flight and a real one. So if they can't tell the difference, I don't think people at home as a 10-year-old watching it from their living room can tell. And there's no
Yeah.
independent press coverage. There's just a TV picture coming from the Nixon administration that we have to assume is factual. And here's the most important thing, Rasa, that the faking of the moon landing is so much more profound historically than if they had actually gone. Do you see that? Either they planted a flag, came back, whoa, that was a close one, or they lied to the whole world, the country that claims to be the greatest accomplishment of mankind, like the ship that God himself could not sink, the Titanic, which sunk, you see? That Nixon called the man on the moon the greatest event in the history of the world, second only to God making the universe. You see, the fact that mankind's greatest boast is part of his folly and fall and deceitfulness, and that they really did fake the moon landing. That is so much more profound historically than if they'd actually gone. So I changed my mind. 5 years later, I said, I'm going to die anyway. This is important. We could have a great awakening about everything. But if people still think, because it's a pleasant lie, that the moon missions are real, we will always have a corrupt government. We have to acknowledge it. It has to come out. And it's really the linchpin. You see, it's the finger out of the dike that will bring all the corruption down, because it will enrage people. I had two NBC news directors say emphatically the tape I uncovered proves beyond any doubt the moon missions were fake. One said it would bring down the federal government if the truth came out. At first, I didn't believe him, but maybe it would. Maybe it'll crash the stock market. Maybe the dollar will crash. I don't know. However, they did fake the moon landing. That's a fact, whether you realize it or not. And that fact should be known by humanity and acknowledged if we ever expect to make progress as a species. I originally turned down making a funny thing happen on the way to the moon for fear that it could be deadly. Then I realized I'm going to die anyway. I might as well go out in a blaze of glory for what is right. And so I changed my mind. And I ended up, who knew it? I did risk my life for the truth. So what? I would rather die for what is right. I remember this time, Rasa. I was going through this seminar, try to, think outside the box and push your fears and things like that. So I never parachuted, right? So I wanted to parachute because I was afraid to do it. So I intentionally kept doing everything I was afraid of over and over and over again. So I go up there and looking down out of the airplane, if you could see a little square there, that's about 15 acres. And I'm like, I'm not jumping out of this airplane. So the way they did it back then, there was no tandem jumping. You literally went out on the wing of the plane by yourself, waiting for a hand signal to be over the right area so you wouldn't land on a power line. And so you had a few seconds there, and I'm thinking, I could work my way back in this airplane. I can put my foot back in there. Don't have to do this. And I was even thinking these people have seen people chicken out before. No big deal. They'll forget about me. And then I realized if I did that, that would be my memory for the rest of my life. And I realized I would rather die than be a coward.
Let me ask you just another really quick question here. It's about Gene. They broke into his house, stole his computer, and he filed a police report. Also, he said that he also had proof that the CIA had threatened him, and his son also had proof that the CIA had threatened him. Can you speak more about this part of the story?
Well, what you're talking about is the son of the man who I witnessed them filming Apollo 11, June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd at 1968 at Cannon Air Force Base, where he was chief of security. His son verified these details. He lived right across from the base entrance in Clovis, New Mexico, and that he got a list from President Johnson, who was there for the first 3 days of filming, of 15 VIP people. They would be allowed to come in and eyewitness this, including Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the list, who weren't apparently even in the spacesuits. They had somebody else as their double. And when I was verifying this for my book at Sibrel.com, he said his house was broken into and as much documentation as possible about his father's, job in the Air Force was confiscated. And then days later, two government employees showed up and threatened to kill him and his family if he ever spoke to me again about his father's participation in the moon landing fraud. This was about 2 years ago. The FBI investigated it. The White House investigated it. The United States Senate Intelligence Committee investigated it. This is very serious business. They did fake the moon landing, and it's a great embarrassment to the United States government if the truth comes out. They can claim they're going to release it someday. We'll see. That would be in their best interest if they did that. I hope the truth does come out. I don't know why they faked it, other than their sheer arrogance to do it. It's very symbolic spiritually about truth and lies, that this great event by the alleged greatest nation on earth was a fraud. A famous writer once said about the Tower of Babel, which was simply built to show off, and it was never finished. You see, just like the Titanic, the ship that God himself cannot sink, never made one voyage. And she said about such a boast in history, the monument of their pride became a memorial of their folly. And that will probably be the case with the moon landing fraud. God willing, the truth will come out for the betterment of mankind. Yeah, well, there are two other movies in the last 4 years that were about faking the moon mission, and apparently one is about to come out now. Maybe they're preparing the public for an admission that
Right.
they were indeed falsifying the moon missions for whatever excuse they come up with. You have to understand, murderers have a reason why they killed, and thieves have a reason why they stole, and people who don't tell the truth have a reason why they lie. That's just justifying their immoral behavior. But it'll be interesting to see what their reason will be for not only having embezzled an equivalent of $200 billion, murdering people like the crew of Apollo 1, whose relatives I interviewed for 7 hours, who's told me that their husband and father was murdered by the CIA for not cooperating with fraud at NASA during, of course, the time of the moon landing fiasco. And so the man who was going to be the first man to walk on the moon, was murdered by the CIA, according to his own wife and son, who I interviewed. And this is the way that it is. So not only did they embezzle money, a third of our income, to deceive us, they used that income to hire CIA agents who murdered our fellow Americans when our country was founded on the Declaration of Independence, which asserts that when any government becomes destructive of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. The first one is life. The federal government is murdering their own people to cover up the moon landing fraud. Not my opinion, the opinion of the dead man's relatives. So that's going to have to come out too.
I have one other question for you, if you don't mind. My question is this. After Astronauts Gone Wild, after you made that, did you somehow still keep in touch with any of the astronauts after that?
No comment on that one. I did have private conversations with several astronauts off the record, and a couple of them made it clear to me that I'm correct and good luck because no one will accept what you have to say. And the moon landing fraud is very symbolic. It's the greatest accomplishment of mankind that the monument of their pride will become a memorial of their folly. The ship that God Himself cannot sink. You see that? And this means something. This is a spiritual battle. And we have sincere people who are sincerely wrong defending the moon landing fraud. Oh, I know America has gotten bad, but at least we went to the moon. And they don't realize that these astronauts are participants in multiple homicides of innocent people. They're not to be honored, they're scoundrels. What does that tell you about the fallen state of the world and our country when our heroes receive medals of honor for being such good liars? That's the state of things, whether people realize it or not. I come along wanting to take away this candy, right? Because whoever killed Kennedy, he's still dead. It's just a matter of changing who did it and why. 9/11, all those people are dead. People might want to change who did it and why. This is different. The moon landing fraud is a positive lie. And I'm trying to take away their candy and give them the reality of manure instead. But the fact is, if you had cancer, would you want to know? If you pretend you don't have it, it's going to eat away and kill you. We have to cut off this gangrene of this moon landing lie, or our country and humanity will never survive.
And so, for you personally, it's about being in the world but not of the world. So what I mean is, being in the world, here we are, we're trying to help remove this cancer tumor, so we're fighting to try to help humanity, but in the end, being not of the world means like, whatever happens, I might die for trying to expose this thing, but that's just not being of the world.
Yeah, Eisenhower made a farewell address on January 19th, 1961. He was president for 8 years. And his last day in office, he said, beware of the corrupt people in the government taking over the country. Why didn't he say that and do something about it for 8 years? I guess he didn't want to be assassinated and wanted to live into retirement and enjoy his grandchildren. But is that decision morally right? No, it was not. He selfishly held on to his life at the forfeiting of 300 million fellow Americans. You see, his successor tried to do something about it, and it cost him his life. So be it. We're going to die anyway. Unfortunately, he made a fearful decision. He wanted to protect his own life at the cost of 300 million other lives. There are honest people in the government hearing my voice who need to come forward and acknowledge the facts of this corruption. And even if people are personally responsible for killing Kennedy, faking the moon landing, who knows what else, I think they should be granted absolute amnesty so that we can get the truth and the facts out for humanity. That's more important than persecuting one person who's probably old and about to meet their maker anyway. We need to know the facts. The facts are so important. So important. So important.